Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Lovely to see so many people with us already this morning. My name is Matt Baird. I'm the founder, host, and chair of the Social Housing Roundtable. This is, I think, episode 171. Judging by some recent numbers we've kind of put together, which is absolutely amazing. If you are ever interested in becoming a speaker or looking through our back catalogue, they're all available on Spotify and YouTube, so you can go and chase up there. But we do this every single Tuesday at 11 a.m. We did 54 of them last year, so we included some Fridays, but we're on for similar numbers this year. But I'm hoping you'll embrace the community, enjoy the community, and if you're someone who comes once every couple of months or once a year or every single week, you are welcome, and it's fantastic to have you with us. We're always looking for new speakers for the roundtable. And this whole process is backed by my recruitment business. So I've been working in recruitment for 14 years. And it's that keeps this running for free. But as I say, usually what I'm doing is I'm speaking to clients or speaking to suppliers and saying, hey, do you want to come on and do a session based on the interesting chats we've had on a recruitment front? And then the other week, this must have been beginning of the year, I saw Eddie had set up his consultancy and was doing a bit of work with the Church of England and was starting to get involved in other things. I thought, you know what? Let's see whether you'd be interested in coming on and doing the Social Housing Roundtable, because I've met Eddie at an event previously. I think his balance in terms of what he delivered, but both as housing minister and also more broadly in the housing space, has been really, really fascinating. And I felt we could have a really, really interesting discussion that was never going to be about, oh, you didn't do this, or you didn't do that, or you did do this, or you did do that, but more looking at that wider spectrum of going, actually, what is our relationships between politics and housing? Where does it go well? Where do we maybe struggle? What more could we do? But speaking to someone who's been on the other side of the table than most of the people who come to the roundtable, which tend to either be suppliers and tenants, and housing providers and landlords themselves, going, but what's it like on the other side of the table? Where are the pitfalls? Where are the struggles? And I'm genuinely delighted that Eddie said yes. So I'm going to pass over to Eddie, who's going to do a bit of an intro and a bit of a helicopter overview of some of the points he wants to raise today, and then we will move to a more open discussion. To those who are new, please feel free, while Eddie's raising some of the points he wants to put questions in the chat or to raise them in there. And once Eddie's finished, we'll open it to a more open discussion more broadly. But what I will say, as ever with the roundtable, we do encourage discussion, we do encourage debate, we encourage different points of view, but we do it respectfully. So do please know that there are guidelines in place, and we just ask that anyone who is commenting today to be respectful in their views and thoughts and try and keep it as balanced as we possibly can. So Eddie, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to you.
Matt, that's marvellous. Thank you very much. I think, Matt, the essence of my view of the world at the moment is that I'm trying to persuade people to love their legislator. And I say that because most people don't have very much to do with their MP. It's sort of like a lawyer. You only tend to go to one if you're in real trouble and nobody else can help you. And I'm just trying to say, actually, regardless of political affiliation, it would be good to get to know your MP, whether that's professionally in terms of your capacity working for a social housing provider, or perhaps more specifically, just to know more about your local MP and what their interests are. And I say that because lots of people say, and this is kind of the position we came to with the title today, a bit of a discussion about social housing and politics for people who don't much like the politics. Well, people think they don't like politics and they don't have anything to do with it. But considering politics decides how fast you can drive on the road, how much tax you pay, how much you pay for your pint in the pub and things like that, it's pretty much in every element of your life. And so it might be no bad thing to get to know A, politicians a bit better, and B, the political process. And I say that because whatever it is that is affecting social housing, whether that's long-term rent settlements or changes in building safety legislation, rather than just react when something happens that you don't like, if you're more involved with politicians while they're formulating legislation or just formulating ideas that lead to white papers that lead to legislation, then you're best placed to kind of leverage some influence, to say the least. So that's my mission, and that's part of the driver behind joining the discussion this morning.
And in terms of, I know we obviously had some ideas of some of the points we wanted to raise today, but I think you've got a couple of anecdotes you want to share in terms of actually where that partnership working has worked, but doesn't always necessarily get the publicity in the same way, and how those smaller scale things can work as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, you're right with regard to smaller scale things. So, for example, Matt, when I first got elected, I knew a young woman who was pregnant and she was going to her GP complaining about having a headache. And the GP was kind of dismissive and said, that's pretty normal thing for pregnant women to experience. Anyway, when she went back, I think the second time with the same symptoms, one of the nurses in the practice said, "Do you think that could be carbon monoxide poisoning?" And she said, "No, it couldn't be. It couldn't be that because I've just moved into a brand new home." Well, it turned out it was exactly that. There was a faulty flue in this brand new property, and she had no idea that she was suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. So backbench MPs have the opportunity to table what's called a 10-minute rule motion, proposing some legislative change they think should happen. So I did that just 3 or 4 months after I got elected. I tabled a suggestion for a change in the law saying that social and private landlords should have carbon monoxide detectors. I continued to campaign on that for a number of years, working with organisations like Shout and with your party parliamentary group for carbon monoxide. And then by some goddamn miracle, because it is incredibly rare that this happens, not only did the law change, but I was the minister in post at the time responsible for signing it into law. Now, that took about 4 years, 3 or 4 years to achieve. So even a tweak like that, you need to be persistent, you need to continue to campaign on it. But it just shows that if you get together with your newly elected backbench MP and you have an idea that you want to share with them as to how the law might change, not only might that MP be able to change the law, but that MP could also grow from a small acorn of a backbench MP into a Secretary of State or the Prime Minister. You never know. So get to know them early while their share value is low, and then they might end up in the cabinet or running the country, and then they'll remember you along the way.
And I know something you shared with me that I found quite not surprising, unfortunately, though I wish it was the opinion that particularly young people have regarding politics at the moment, and not just in terms of one party, but more generally. And the challenge that has with this kind of Love Your Legislative program that obviously you're pushing is the fact that actually that trust at the moment and almost apathy is maybe higher than it's ever been, but that's difficult to overcome.
I think it is really difficult to overcome. I think perhaps too many times politicians have promised things, or at least set an expectation or an aspiration that things are going to change or they're going to be able to deliver more than they can. And then when, for various reasons, they don't live up to that. And let's face it, there could be 2 reasons they don't live up to it. So first of all, the ambition was just too great in the first place, and they were, kind of pitching something that was never going to be deliverable. Or more importantly, that circumstances come along that knock you off course, that mean that you're not able to deliver the thing you wanted to deliver. So, for example, my first proper promotion, Boris Johnson won the election in December 2019. I was lucky enough to be chosen to second the Queen's speech. That's the only time a backbench MP gets to make a speech to a jam-packed House of Commons. So I was chosen to make that speech, and I think it went down well in number 10. And so I ended up being promoted to the Whip's office in January. And we were all excited about the things we were going to do as a new government. And just 2 months later, or 2.5 months later, COVID arrived and all bets were off. The world just changed completely. I distinctly remember being in the Whip's office, and before any of this was really hitting the headlines, and the Chief Whip came in and he looked pale. And I said, "Is everything all right, Mark?" And he said, "This COVID thing," he said, 250,000 people could die. And it just kind of changed everybody's perspective as to what challenge we were about to face. And then bit by bit, that news spread around the world. So yeah, regardless of your intentions, anything can knock you off course. And I imagine Rachel Reeves is probably feeling a bit of that at the moment. She certainly didn't start with the expectation of having to pump loads of money into defense because there was concern about our relationship with America and so on. So yeah, we
And I
need
think
to set a realistic.
isn't it? You know, this is what we were discussing before, which is that we know there's a need for housing. It's clearly the current government's biggest push, and almost the biggest pledge completely. And yet, more money in defence, interesting relationships with both Russia and Ukraine and America at the moment, tariffs coming up and everything else. What was it like when, I guess, and I know you know, one of the things you can talk about was kind of like a typical Monday, but I think it's a challenge when there isn't maybe a typical day in Parliament. But when you were trying to kind of go, great, I've got these ideas and I want to push these things through and this is what I want to do, and suddenly something like that comes in. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get another pandemic, though, you know, I know there's plenty of rumours out there that there's another one, whatever it might be. You know, when something that big comes through, as it tends to do, unfortunately, semi-regularly, you know, the last few years, how is that relationship? You know, did you notice the relationship with your constituents and things change because you weren't able to deliver promises that you'd said you were going to deliver, even though some of those and some, and we can, like I say, we're not being specifics on what achieved and what didn't, but some of those almost became completely unattainable.
Well, I'll give you an example of what was one of the most difficult times for me personally as a constituents MP, and for me working in the Whip's office, was Marcus Rashford's campaign for free school meals. Now, on the one hand, and you're dead right, there is the reason we have different political parties in this country is because different people will think problems, you know, we want to reach the same objective, but we might choose different ways of tackling it. Now, regardless of the rights or the wrongs, we don't need to get into that of that policy and whether what Marcus was doing. There was an expectation set for some people that suddenly the government could possibly start feeding all children for breakfast in the morning or something like that, whatever the expectation associated with it was. But the person, whoever is pitching the idea, needs to realize that to a degree at least, money is finite in terms of resource for the government. And if you start doing one thing, you almost certainly have to stop doing something else. But the greater point was that it became really quite vitriolic in terms of the incoming emails that MPs were giving. And generally speaking, our experience is that these things kind of peak and then they peter out. But this kind of lasted a bit longer, and it to the point that one of the MPs in my flock had to move his family out of the constituency because of the level of abuse that they were getting. And I think in more than 3 cases, people have subsequently gone to prison for the abuse that they levelled at MPs during my time in the Whip's office. So sometimes it is really difficult because expectations are set by people who don't have to find the funding for them, and that causes a problem, or because we live in a world where, if you imagine, I don't know, 40 years ago, an MP might get 10 letters a week in the post, and now something like that blows up and an MP can literally get 1,000 emails overnight. And we're much more accessible. Your MPs are, and social media and things like that mean that effectively they're either accessible to you or they're accessible for people to level abuse at 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. So we live in a strange world sometimes, and our relationship with our politicians, to that point that you made at the start, Matt, if you don't feel that politicians generally are valued or honest or, you know, committed to working in the best interest of their community and their country, then you're going to feel that it's okay to be abusive to them. And my personal experience is that of all the MPs I've ever met, I would say the massive majority of them, that's the reason they signed up. They want to do something for their country and their community. They're here to do good. And different people have different ideas of whether the approach that they're taking to do that good is the right one, but they're in it for the right reasons.
Really interesting. Like I say, I don't think it's helped by media more generally. I think, unfortunately, it is. I put out a post last week that had nothing to do with a political stance. I was just interested in the media narrative. It was to do with the disability cuts, and it was a BBC one that said 3 million people are going to be worse off, and then the bottom, but 3.8 million could be better. Now, I'm not saying what's good, what's bad. It was very much trying to be a neutral as a post, but it was saying, well, those numbers could be flipped, and suddenly the entire 3.8 million are better off, but 3 million could be. The entire perception of the way that's delivered is difficult. And I think it's very interesting in the world of social media, particularly with news outlets and other things that are out there as well at the moment. Bad news is easier to sell than good, as we know. Negatives are, spread far quicker. And I think it's one of those where sometimes it's very easy for constituents and people on our side to go, just make the change we're all asking for, without knowing actually what's maybe being pulled elsewhere. So do you think, and I remember I think someone has said in the chat there, because the chat's going off, so we're definitely going to raise some questions. But
well, Matt, just let me, I'm trying to ignore some of those questions, but just let me give you one. This is my favorite personal example, right? So I'm a local authority councillor, and 30 local residents come to see me and they say, it's flipping dangerous, this road. There's cars speeding up and down it all the time. Nobody cares. Somebody's going to get hurt. You need to put speed bumps in. So we put some speed bumps in. We do some calculations and we say, perhaps the traffic does need slowing down. And then we get 30 people turn up at the surgery the following week. And they say, you can't have these speed bumps. It's bloody terrible. You're taking the bottom off my car. And, people are revving their engines as they go over. And so whatever you might think that's a daft example, people listening at home, but anybody who thinks, oh, just do it this way and it will be all right, hasn't listened to the 10 million other people who say, no, just do it the other way and then it'll be all right. Because I'm telling you, that's exactly how it goes on any issue that lights up. People will say, another good example would be foreign aid. People say, you must help people overseas. They're in a dreadful position. And if we need to help and support them, look at this terrible tragedy that they've been through. And then other people say, you can't give money overseas. Look at the terrible poverty that exists in our own country in certain places. We need to lift children out of poverty. How can you send money out of the country when charity begins at home? So whatever the issue, and no matter how reasonable and neutral it might be, I guarantee you there's 5,000 opinions on how it should be solved.
Completely fair. I'm going to just go to some of the points in the chat. If anyone would like to dive in, please use the react function at the bottom of the screen and use the raise hand gesture, and we'd certainly love to hear from you. So a point that's been raised by Judith: have you seen the crime and policing bill's apparent proposal to criminalise social housing tenants for annoying other tenants? What can be done to prevent things like that getting into law, given the fact that annoying someone can simply be because the person who was annoyed has low tolerance levels? It doesn't necessarily equate to someone doing something wrong. And I imagine you had questions like this all the time while you were in post.
Well, can I say, I mean, the reason this is a fascinating question is there were 2 or 3 bills. So I was responsible for transitioning the social white paper into the social housing regulation 2023 bill. And when you get down to the detail of certain things, there's intense discussion on even single lines of clauses to understand, and even never mind single lines of clauses, the words that are used in them. So, for example, a word that's often used in legislation and then is contested forever afterwards is reasonable. Reasonable behavior, reasonable competence, reasonable whatever it is, and then lawyers argue about what side of the line of reasonable different levels of behavior fall. So there will be some people will have posed particular examples of saying, maybe if we use this type of language, it would help us address this fairly significant problem. And then there'll be some haggling backwards and forwards, some consultation with charities and social housing providers and so on as to where we should settle on the language. And then eventually we settle on something and not everybody will be happy. But in that example, that was used. It is a really good point about not wanting to bring people down on the criminalize them, shall we say, side of the line, when actually what they need is, care and support or something like that. So it's a really fine line. But I just tell you, I'm not exaggerating when I say hours of discussion can go into a single clause in order to try to formulate language that everybody thinks is appropriate and will tackle the problem. But just as a side note, one of the fascinating things I find is whatever in legislation you introduce, and no matter how much thought has gone into it, somebody will find a way to interpret it in a malevolent way or to use it for criminal advantage or something like that. So it is difficult, but I completely sympathize with the person making that.
It's certainly an ongoing debate around what is ASB and what isn't, and what's responsible and what isn't. And I think you've highlighted the point brilliantly there. So thank you. The point here, a question from Grant. I have a question. With the increasing pressure on local authorities to provide suitable and affordable housing, how do you see the new legislation impacting the ability of councils and housing providers to effectively tackle homelessness and improve housing supply? What measures are in place to ensure these legislative changes lead to tangible improvements rather than adding further bureaucratic hurdles? And I don't know how much of that you can specifically answer, seeing as obviously you're, with your current role, but I think more generally looking at that kind of question in terms of those pressures aren't new, they're increasing all the time. How did you find it when you were on the other side of the bench to go, well, actually, how can we, as you say, try and please everyone when you know it's impossible?
Well, let me answer that question from two perspectives. So first of all, when I was working on a refresh of the government's plan to tackle homelessness, that required lots of conversations with other government departments. And for my part, it felt like the discussion with health was absolutely paramount, given the percentage of people who are rough sleeping, for example, who are suffering from mental health problems or drug and alcohol problems. It's not just about the absence of a home that is causing their problems, it's other contributing factors. And so part of our problem, I think, is that, for my part, is that we don't upstream enough. We don't try to catch people early on enough in their kind of downward spiral, as it were, at a point where we can, to use this strange word, fix them. The earlier you intervene, the more likely you are to have a positive outcome in terms of changing people's direction of travel in their lives. And so, on the one hand, I would say that's absolutely critical. And I think people like Ligia and the team at the Centre for Homelessness Impact do some incredible work on studying different methods that people are applying, not just across the country, but internationally, and trying to make sure that we deploy those here. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand is, just to say, only because it was such a fascinating discussion, I had a call recently with a guy called Shamel from Change Please. Now, this came about because I was on the train and Change Please was written on the cup that I was having my coffee from. And I ended up having a discussion with the guy who founded this organization. And basically, he's using the money that he earns from selling coffee and setting up coffee businesses to then support people who are homeless, people in temporary accommodation, to give them jobs, train them as baristas, and get them employment, get them training, get them more permanent, sustainable accommodation. And so sometimes the answer doesn't have to lie in what the government is doing, because there are some incredibly hardworking and industrious people out there who are coming up with smarter and more effective ways of tackling some part of the problem. Now, it's a big jigsaw with lots of pieces, but I think we need everybody playing their part, which is why I'm really delighted that I've recently joined St Mungo's as an ambassador to try and help them promote the good work that they do as well.
And I think therein lies some of the challenge, in that quite often I feel people hope that the government will fix it without realizing, and I think what people are beginning to realize, and it's not a good thing, but I'll begin to realize more and more, is that actually it's just too big a piece for even a government to fix. And there's so many parts to it that unfortunately it's going to require a bit from everyone, even if those. So, and sometimes you do get that kind of resentment of going, "God, the government should fix this. I guess I better." But that mindset, I think, has to change. And then come through from Brian that I wanted to ask you alongside this, because I think it would be interesting. Because one thing you haven't really mentioned so far actually was your background before you became an MP, which might be interesting to touch on in terms of your knowledge of social housing isn't just because you're an MP, and I think it'd be interesting to highlight some of that. But Brian had asked, do you think the focus on affordable housing has left many people behind rather than the focus on the provision of homes for social rent and is creating stigma for those who live in social homes? Shouldn't the focus change to the provision of homes for all? And then this is something that I know in your background, certainly as chair and other roles that you've done, has been something you've been campaigning for years.
Yeah, I have to say, obviously, I was a Conservative MP and we've got a Labour government, but I applaud just about everything the government is doing to try to hit that target that it's got of 1.5 million homes. And the Office of Budget Responsibility said just last week that they expect that some of the changes that are being made with regard to planning will help us perhaps reach by 2029 a 40-year high for the number of homes that we're building. So I like the idea. Let's build more homes. Let's build more affordable homes or social rent homes. The government has objectives for all of those things. So I'm delighted to see that happen. And from my background, you're absolutely right, Matt. Before I became an MP, I chaired the board of Walsall Housing Group, WHG, 20-odd thousand houses in Walsall and across the West Midlands. So I had good experience of, well, in my opinion, they are simply one of the best social housing providers in the country. Absolute exemplary organisation. I loved working with them. So it's good to have had that experience. And then at the other end of the extreme in terms of scale, I was Deputy Chief Exec at YMCA in Birmingham, where we had 300 homes for young people who'd otherwise be at risk of homelessness. But I tell you what, that place taught me so much in terms of understanding the challenges of providing people with accommodation and needing to be patient in the support that you provided to them. But basically, in order to buy a house in this country at the moment, it's typically something like 7 or 8 times multiplier on your salary. Whereas when I bought my house, it was typically 3 times your salary. So in terms of affordability, and depending on where you are in the country, this is more acute, which is another point in terms of this is just a quick side story, Matt, if you'd be so kind.
Please do.
I thought in Birmingham, there are 5,000 households in temporary accommodation, and I thought that is a massive number, but actually, relatively, it isn't. Birmingham has got a population of roughly 1.14 million people. Newham, a borough in London with a population of just 350,000 people, has 1,000 more households in temporary accommodation, 6,000 households in temporary accommodation in Newham. And also, even though some London boroughs or across some London boroughs, they're doing a really good job of building more homes. So I think it was Ealing a couple of years ago built something like just over 2,000 homes, 2,100 homes in a year across the borough altogether, not the council, but that's how many were built. But housing applications come into London boroughs at approximately 75 a week. That's nearly 4,000 a year. So even if you are hitting like the highest rate of house building, 4,000 in your borough 2,000 in your borough per year, housing applications are coming in at a quicker rate. So we really do need to find a way to push to the 1.5 million and beyond in order to make sure that there's housing for everybody.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home, offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys and much more. They also provide beyond warden calls, an easier, simpler and lower cost wireless ward and call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare and smoke alarms. Alertical works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alertical won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024.
Thank you very much. We're going to change slight avenues here, simply because there's been a number of points that have raised more around that kind of politics and housing point that we're discussing, and understandably there's been a little bit of pushback on a couple of bits. So I'm going to kind of collate a few of the points here and then come back to you, Eddie. So Judith had said that people can feel that MPs are doing a bad job and lobby for change. They don't all abuse MPs. Let's step away from labelling all people the same way. Claire had mentioned that people understand that things change, but I feel there's sometimes a lack of openness. It feels as though politicians don't feel the nation can manage an adult conversation, instead spend their energy on cross-party arguing. Alicia said we need an adult cross-party discussion. The welfare state as it imagined by Beveridge is no longer sustainable, and we were going to need to talk about our priorities before the increase in the defence budget. We've known for over 30 years we're going to hit this crisis now. While we continue short-term party political solutions to social problems such as health and housing, we're going to get nowhere, and that's what frustrates those of us with an understanding of politics with a small p. Sarah had said, what can social housing providers do to regain the trust and confidence of MPs after their tragedies of Grenfell, Awabishak and others? And Colin had highlighted that when politicians say something, the public expect it to happen, but there's an apathy, as past experience has never met expectations, i.e. Brexit, and even now there's pushback. And the reason I've collated those is because I think it's more broadly that conversation between trust of your MP and of the public and of the nation, based on many years and many governments of letdowns or of perceived letdowns, should we say, and certainly some of them have been massive problems, and some have been, like I say, more perceived. But equally, you know, when we talk about the relationships between your MP, I think no matter who gets elected in and where they come and whatever the background might be, there's almost a distrust before it starts. And I said, I've been trying to find a way to get in touch with my MP and I can't work out how. And things like that are very difficult, because I thought that's what I would try since we've been talking. I wanted to try and get hold of my MP and have a discussion to kind of talk about my experiences.
Yeah.
And I've not been able to. And that in itself is a challenge. So I think there is definitely a challenge there to going, well, I absolutely agree with what you've said in terms of build those relationships, get to know them, understand what they're lobbying for, understand what their politics are and what you can push and what you're never going to be able to push, and see where that goes. But equally, there seems to certainly be from the chatter thing of going, well, actually, I just don't trust MPs at all.
Yeah.
And again, that isn't just based on the last government, that's based on subsequent governments that we've had. And where do you think that challenge lies, and how big a challenge did you perceive that being from your side of the desk?
Well, yeah, I mean, sorry, can I just begin with the first point with regard to about labelling people the same way, given the fact that a relatively small number of people are abusive to MPs? I completely take on board that point. The real point I was making was, under no circumstances should we live in a society where 2 MPs have been killed during the time that I was involved in politics, and at least 5 people have gone to prison as a result. 3 people during my time in the Wits Office, at least 5 people have gone to prison for abusing MPs. So you're dead right, it is a small number of people. I completely accept that, and most people are great in the way they interact, but it's just a bit personal when I've lost a friend. So but generally, this point about, you're right, how do we rebalance? Because I think sometimes politicians are almost frightened to be too candid, too straight with the public, because on the one hand, you want to get elected, and if you start telling them things they don't want to hear, they'll simply elect somebody who is going to tell them what they want to hear. And somehow we just need, which is, I come back again to my point, love your legislator, maybe not love them, but at least try and get to know them. Although, Matt, it seems like it's not as straightforward as I might have thought it was, which is maybe I need to do some work on the MPs and get them to engage with the public as well. But if we all just get to know each other a bit better, I think MPs might be a bit more better calibrated with what they are prepared to discuss and honest and open enough to discuss with the public, and the public are realistic about what they can expect from their politicians. And I think there is some rebalancing to be done there, to say the least. So, and with regard to, it's interesting, this stuff about a grown-up cross-party discussion. I mean, I feel there are certain areas where politics is finding a bit more common ground. It strikes me, and some people in the Labour Party won't be happy about it, but Wes Streeting seems like he's being quite candid about what's required to move the NHS in the direction it needs to go. Now, I think there have been times where if politics was a bit like football, when you're looking across at the other benches, if I could buy in a player from another team, who would I buy in? Well, Wes's backstory is just so phenomenal. You know, brought up in social housing. I think his granddad used to visit his granddad in prison. And yet Wes just, you know, worked hard, ended up going to Oxford, and now is a bloody Secretary of State. So this is a guy who understands what life is like for lots of people and has risen to that challenge. And I think he's being quite candid about some of the things that need to change. And so maybe we need a bit of that from both sides of the political divide, being, you know, perhaps moving in the direction of each other to find more common ground, because I'm sure there are examples of where there is common ground, and sometimes you try to pretend there isn't, just to create a political difference between you. So yeah, I think maybe we'll see more of that in the future.
Thank you. I think it was certainly, it drove me a little bit crazy when I was listening to the the emergency budget that came out the other day. And regardless of what went into it, and I can see some points in the chat which have been raised around their frustration and anger with some of the stuff that was being delivered, and others on a different side of the coin. Every point was finished with, which is something that they didn't do, which is something that they didn't do. And I was like, look, whatever we're at, this is where we are. And having lots of minds together who can genuinely collaborate can only be a good thing.
Matt, can I just say, you've just reminded me of probably the most important point that I needed to make today, which is lots of what you see on the, and this is one of the things that infuriates me a bit, and maybe to a degree I've even been part of it, so I can't complain too much about it. But what you see often on the telly is what's happening in the chamber of the House of Commons, and that tends to be a bit more theatrical and a bit more partisan than everything else that's going on in the rest of the parliamentary estate. So, for example, there are literally hundreds of all-party parliamentary groups. That's a group of MPs from different political parties who get together to try and work on solutions to particular problems. So there might be an APBG for homelessness, or for social housing, or for temporary accommodation, and those people getting together to try and find a way through that. And also, people don't realise, lots of people don't realise anyway, that there's another debating chamber in Parliament, Westminster Hall. And there's debates going on in there frequently for a few hours every day, and people aren't even aware of it. And that tends to be more granular discussion, and what is often attended by people very well informed. And then also there's the work that people do on select committees, 10 or 12 select committees, cross-party membership there, and actually lots of the work they do is quite collaborative. So I think sometimes the problem we have is we're viewing politics through the lens of what happens at PMQs on a Wednesday at midday, and that's the ultimate expression of tribalism, and that's probably the worst expression of how our parliament works when it's working at its best. And can I just say, I mean, so an example would be Matthew Pennycook, who is the housing minister. I got on really well with him. And once or twice when we'd have been in bill committee looking at legislation, he might have proposed a change that I knew that my side of the government couldn't support. I wasn't the minister on a particular bill, somebody else was. And Matthew proposed something, and I stood up and said, that's a very interesting suggestion. I think it has merit, and I hope the minister will go away and look at that. And as a result of that, Matthew and I get on really, really well. And he was good enough to let me have time for a meeting a couple of weeks ago. And Rushanara Ali, the homelessness minister, absolutely the same. I asked to meet her when I was next in Parliament, and we had a cup of tea together, which she paid for, by the way. And she was absolutely brilliant in kind of talking me through the current thinking and me giving some thoughts on where I thought there were particular challenges. So sometimes what's going on behind the scenes, if the public could see that, and there's no way of the public seeing all of that, but if they could, they might think that politics was a bit better than it is, and anything that moves the dial in the right direction.
Well, the media are driving that, us and them anyway, because obviously it sells more and everything else. So
yeah, exactly.
When that's what we see, immediately it just drives that tribalism, and then you do get more extreme parties, or parties with views that are potentially more either far left, far right, whatever you want to say, coming through, because this is how people can resonate and understand. And so that level of pantomime is interesting. But I'm going to carry on going with some of the points in the chat because we're flying through time.
We could have done with 2 hours, because I'm seeing like loads of interesting stuff, and not all of it helpful to me, but still fascinating. You're a great crowd today. That's all I can say.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that the audience is ticking those boxes, and you can see exactly why we wanted you on in the first place. But Sue Healy had said earlier, why can't the government learn spend to save principle? Why do we struggle with this? Instead of paying obscene amounts of money, reacting to homelessness, why aren't we building more? Why?
Let's just hold that thought for a second, because
absolutely.
it is. I have massive sympathy with that point. The problem is dual funding. You have to spend, you have to invest in something that you think is going to work while working on something that is effectively holding back the tide at the same time. And within any department, and within any bit of any department, your funding is going to be limited. Although, I say, when I mentioned earlier, upstreaming, earlier intervention with mental health and drug and alcohol abuse are obviously the right thing to do. And yet, at the same time, you still have to fund the support that is currently being given to people who are in the most dire conditions, suffering from both of those problems. So yeah, if we suddenly had a load more money that was just magicked from somewhere and could do that, I think that would be brilliant. The problem is you're trying to hold back the tide while still trying to invest more money, and it's difficult to do both. Because on any one issue, it's kind of funny, when you become a minister, you realize you're kind of given your headline title, but my range of responsibilities, for example, actually, I meant to mention that as well. So I was the minister responsible for, as well as a building safety minister, I was the minister responsible for liaison with the Grenfell community in the run-up to the 5th anniversary of that tragic fire. And so I fully invested in terms of taking that role very seriously and spending as much time as I could visiting people. There are another 15 things on the list of your responsibility. I was responsible for changing the building regs, so all new houses have to have a heat pump or solar panels. As well as all my, the Minister for Social Housing. So it's a huge responsibility, and you realise even within my small bit of the department, I've got lots of competing demands and things that I would like to fund more into, but I'd have to take money from something else in order to do it. So.
Thank you. There's a point which come through from Sarah. What I'm going to try and do is focus on questions, because I'm where we're running through time. So if you have raised points and I can't pull a question out of it, please don't think I'm being rude. So Sarah said, local planning discussions are always controversial. There's a desperate need for new homes, but these often face fierce local opposition. How can we support MPs to be more robust in their advocacy for the new homes that are needed to tackle the housing crisis in this context?
I tell you what, this is where we are going to need an hour just on this discussion. But so here's my point, right? So I was a councillor before I became an MP, and when I was a minister, I was a planning minister. So sometimes when big decisions were called in, I would have a look at those as well. So what do we know? We know that sometimes political decisions or planning decisions are taken from a position of political expediency. If I'm a local councillor and I'm up for election next year, and lots of people come to complain to me that they don't want this housing development to go on this site that used to be a field or something like that, and I side with them because I want to be elected next year, and then I'll be able to do loads of other good stuff. Whereas if I don't side with them and I'm not elected, I won't be able to do any good stuff. So sometimes that decision happens. Now, the change in the planning legislation means that the Labour government want to ensure that only any decision that actually meets with national and local legislation and local plans and so on should bypass the planning committee altogether, and that decision should just be given to officers to approve in line with the local and national legislation. So that's going to help in some ways, but it's also going to mean that those people who are complaining about a particular site and going to see their councillor about it now feel disenfranchised because they feel they don't have a say on that development, whereas actually they might have had a say if they'd contributed to the formulation of the local plan 2 years previously. So yeah, personally, I like the idea. Saying that out loud is probably going to get me into trouble, but the idea that fewer decisions go to planning committees to make strikes me as in some cases that might be a helpful move. Let's put it that way.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to go to people who I've not seen points from. So there's a question here from Jamie. How might we contribute to a reset in what trust looks like in public sector organisations more broadly? Can we find a way of working somewhere between the grid points of an inability to do everything desired, rising expectations of service standards, and people's firm beliefs in the rightness of their own view? There you are, Eddie. Fix the country in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'd love to think there might be a solution to that, although I'm not sure what it is. I mean, to the point that I think we've got 65 million people in the country, and they've all got a very slightly different view as to how any element of running of that country should be handled. But I just wonder, I strongly feel, as I say, that people view politics through the lens of PMQs, and that doesn't help. I just wonder whether some TV program or something that takes us a bit. I appreciate it's not going to be as exciting as the Netflix F1 program, but something that takes us more behind the scenes to give us a feel for what actually happens in Parliament might help make people feel slightly more trusting in the process that is governing their country. And let's face it, I mean, we might have some real interesting times ahead, because depending on how the election goes, if reform continues to sustain their rise, depending on whether the Lib Dems continue to do as well as they did in the last election, there is a chance that we might move towards a more kind of rainbow coalition position in Parliament, where you have to have a coalition government, and then there will be more informed debate about all elements of it. But we did have experience with a coalition government, didn't we, with the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, and that didn't end well for the Lib Dems subsequently. So who knows how it might go. But it feels like at the moment, if the bookies and the polls are right, maybe we're going to have a broader political representation in Parliament.
Shonak had said that I applaud Angela Rayner's commitment to housing, but living in Cornwall, I feel less hopeful about the future of housing for young people particularly. Can you suggest how best to work with MPs to improve local housing solutions? I know you've touched on that a little bit more broadly, but what I wanted to do was also points that have been raised by a number of people around young people not in education, employment and training, around apprenticeship, the future of housing not having the labour that it needs. With the way that was viewed, both where you were previously, in terms of your work with YMCA, then as an MP and now, Is this something that you're seeing is being taken as seriously as maybe the housing sector is shouting about, or is it still something that's just another issue to deal with, and therefore isn't being given the time maybe that it needs more broadly?
No, I mean, again, yeah, I need to think of another form of words rather than I feel great sympathy, but I understand this problem, because there are certain parts of the country where, for example, the prevalence of second homeowners makes it incredibly difficult then for local people to get on the housing ladder, and we saw some real extreme examples of this post-COVID, where people suddenly realized that the working from home culture was going to stay. And actually, they didn't need to live in London and be tied to their desk there. They could go and live in Cornwall and dial in and just pop up to London every couple of weeks. And so we heard examples of people buying houses more or less as soon as they went on the market without having viewed them. And then that just caused an escalation in prices. And then that drives not just young people, but lower paid people, care workers, nurses on the first leg of the ladder, out of the housing system. And so somehow we need to find a way to rebalance that. And one of those ways was trying to allow dramatic increases in council tax and things like that to make it, just try to make it too expensive for some people to own two homes when other people didn't own one. So yeah, I mean, and with regard to my work with YMCA and the challenges that young people have getting on the housing ladder, I mean, it's just phenomenal. But that's why not just more social housing, but more social rent housing is absolutely critical. And I think we've toyed with some other ideas for key workers, housing for key workers, and so on. But I just feel that we're going to need to keep chipping away at that problem until somebody comes up with a financial solution that allows us to help critical people get accommodation.
Thank you very much. I can see lots of other things coming through. I know a couple of people that said there's a Clary said I have to leave, but I'd like to thank Eddie for his insights. I feel a mix of relief that politics is more and better than what we see on PMQs. But I'm also more frustrated that politicians aren't making more effort to dispel some of those myths, making it appear they're happy with the pantomime. And I think that's a really interesting takeaway from certainly today. Bob has just said houses should be built as homes for people to live in, not for people to buy and sell as chattels for profit. But Sue, there was a question that came through.
Sorry, Matt, just let me tell you a quick story, right? So I was the minister on the responsible for the private the renters reform bill. But I am a landlord myself, an accidental landlord, because when I got together with my wife, she had a house. She didn't have as much confidence in our relationship in those early days as I did. I sold my place so we could buy a place together. She kept hers, and 15 years later, we've still got it. But we never put up the rent for the people living in that house. So unless between tenancies. But if our current tenant has been with us for about 4 years, no rent rises, because I'm just happy somebody has got a home and is paying the rent and has that rent stability for the time that they live in our home. So yeah, sometimes there is a problem. You're right with regard to people buying property as a means of, as a commodity effectively, when there are people without them. But I honestly think if you speak to my tenant, you would find that I'm an excellent landlord. And I think there are more of us out there who behave in a similar way.
I've rented this house I'm in, and where people I've run the round table from this for 4 years now, and I've rented this place. The rent went up very briefly when the interest rate spiked. And 4 years on, we've been able to buy this house at a discount from our landlord, because they've given us a decent discount because we've been long-term tenants. And I find it's a difficult moral question, because yes, if every landlord was suddenly made to sell their home, yes, house prices would inevitably come down because they'd have to, because supply and demand. But equally, the housing market would completely crash, the economy would absolutely crash, and people still wouldn't necessarily have money to buy the home in the first place. There is a need for landlords. Just what they look like is interesting. I do think there's a massive for the private rented sector, but that's a whole nother debate. But there had been a question I want to raise from Sue before we move into last kind of final thoughts, which was that in your view, do housing providers and recipients of housing, so including social rent tenants and shared owners, have comparable, albeit different, influence, or do we need better mechanisms for residents to inform political housing priorities at a national level?
Well, one of the main things that came out of Grenfell for me was the need for social tenants to have a voice. And so we made sure that we publicised things like helping them understand how to make a complaint. We set up a kind of national panel of tenants to make sure that they would be listened to at the highest level. And I went off around the country seeing various housing associations who had set up their own tenant panels. So I think we're in a much better place where tenants feel more respected and more listened to. And I've seen, the National Housing Federation have done an absolutely stellar job in terms of promoting this sort of thing. So I think we're in a much better place today than we were 5 years ago. And also, if you go and see, if you can get to see your MB and get to know them and have some influence, then it would be tenure blind, I think would be the best way to put that. They'll just be happy to see somebody engaging with them.
Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of collate some of the points that have been raised in the chat today so that you can, as I say, you can have a look at those afterwards as well and bring those together. What I do want to say is, as Sue's mentioned, it's about informing policy in the best way we can, not just making the complaint, but how does that change? I think it's about getting that voice as loud as possible. And that's an ongoing battle. And I think it still will be, because as people have mentioned earlier on, the stigmatization and things like that is unfortunately still there, no matter how much we wish it wasn't. And I'm sure, Eddie, you've seen this yourself in conversations that I'm not asking you to quote on or comment on, but I can't imagine for a second that when you've got that many MPs and people more broadly in a room, that there isn't going to be an element of stigmatization from somewhere because of our different ethics backgrounds and everything else that kind of comes with it. What I do want to say is a massive thank you to you for coming on. I've not done a roundtable where it was just me and the guest speaking for an hour for a long, long time, but I think there have been that many points made in the chat that it's kind of thrown that way. So I hope everyone's found it insightful, and if anyone is listening back, doesn't just think it was me and Eddie in a room coming up with questions. we had 75 of us in here at one point, and I can absolutely assure you it wasn't. But Eddie, in terms of that final points from yourself on politics, housing, and the relationship between the two, what would you like to see as that kind of thing that really needs to change now and quickly if we're going to start moving forward in the way that I think everyone is really desiring and wanting?
Well, I think the big problem is we need to see what happens in the spending review with regard to cash that's going to come in. But it feels to me what we need to do is give the government some space to develop the ideas that they've had, publish and get the legislation through Parliament, because I think things like streamlining the planning decision process, the introduction of the concept of grey belt, I think is a good one. I've seen some pieces of land that nobody would describe as green, and they should have social housing on them. So I think rather than expect everything to happen overnight, let's give the government a chance to breathe and actually deliver on some of the things that they've said they're going to do so far. And I think it's the job of any opposition to support them where they're going in the right direction and nudge and cajole them when perhaps they overstep the mark or don't go far enough.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Eddie, for coming on today. To those who are new to our community, I say we do this every Tuesday. Next week, we've got Stuart Davison, who's the Managing Director of Elahan Consulting, talking about COVID's tech legacy and the transformative tools that we found and then forgot. So it could be another interesting insight. But for now, Eddie,
Matt, can I just ask, if any of the listeners are on LinkedIn and they're involved in social housing, send me an invite.
I think that might be an interesting one for you. I think your inbox is about to get flooded, but I hope it's in a possible way. But yeah, a huge thanks to you for coming on today, Eddie, and the best of luck with everything you're doing with Church of England, NFB, and the other parts you've got coming up, because I know you are genuinely trying to help in the best way you possibly can at the moment. And I think your insight, regardless of political standpoint, can be incredibly useful to help make change. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Cheers all. Take care.